Foley Center from People in Forests, and Mary Hawk, craftsman, writer, and teacher, and Brian Schwan from Women's Voices for the Earth. And each of them will share with you some approaches to stewardship from their individual and professional perspectives. I'm not sure who's going to go.
We're going to go right now for, I guess, Jerry.
You can go in the printed order. I would prefer to speak without the microphone. Can you hear me at this point? Okay. I want to begin with an image that lasted about 2 seconds. One morning I was driving from Helena to Missoula. I'm sure it was morning because the light was behind me. Otherwise, I would not have seen what I saw. Somewhere near Avon, I saw a red-shafted flicker on Highway 12. That in itself was unusual. But this flicker was bent over its fallen mate. For all the world, it appeared to me that this bird was trying to make sense of what had happened to its partner. It might be possible to say that this bird was grieving. I am well aware that the kind of things I am ascribing to this bird constitute what philosophers have called the pathetic fallacy. But the posture of this bird unmistakably expressed a sense of loss. I saw this and drove on, contemplating what I saw. For every instance that we see deeply into creation and sense the will to live and the pain of loss, felt, I believe, by all beings, there are thousands of times when we see little or nothing at all. But the few instances when we see through the veil may affect us profoundly and the way in which we see in the future. When I saw one bird standing over its dead mate, I realized once again that other creatures want to live as much as we do, that other creatures are affected by changes in their habitat just as we are. When we are children, we know these things. They make perfect intuitive sense. But as we mature, the injuries we suffer, our losses, changes, defeats, disappointments, pile on top of each other like layers of dead skin, and the sensitivity and sensibility that come so easily to a child become calloused, if not deadened. If we are not careful, we begin to constrict the circle of our concern, shut down the capacity to empathize and respond until we are left at last only with ourselves. At a conference such as this, we are reminded of our responsibility to be stewards of the ground on which we live, the air that fills our lungs, the water that is the lifeblood of this earth, and all the creatures, human and otherwise, who depend on this, the ground of our being. But what I want to say in these moments is that we also need to be stewards of our own sensibilities, so that we do not go numb and dead and then cease to care. Looking at my own life, I realize that the capacity to feel and to care rises and falls in a rhythm. I pay attention to this rhythm in my own life. Just as there are times when I am acutely aware of other beings, there are also times when nothing breaks through the armor I construct. Observing my own life, I have come then to believe that the capacity to feel and to care is weakened by feeling that is not followed by action. Therefore, when we feel our concern for creation, it is best to respond in some fashion. To make a phone call, write a letter, cast a vote, do something rather than swallow the impulse to respond. Shutting down that responsive impulse can become a habit, a deadening habit. I have come to believe that the capacity to feel and to care is weakened when we focus too much on results The powers that work against us are enormous, if not demonic. And in this respect, I think the church may be more realistic than the environmental community. Therefore, it is better to focus on where you stand and what you value than only on what you hope to achieve. I have come to believe that the capacity to feel and to care is weakened when we focus on the short term. Therefore, it is wise to take the point of view of a tree, growing in good seasons, absorbing and integrating the impacts of storms or drought, but pressing on slowly toward the light. It also seems clear to me, observing my own life, that the capacity to feel and to care is weakened when we try to cover all bases. It is easy to feel overwhelmed by both the opportunities to care for creation and the needs before us. Pick at least one thing that you know and love and act, because the best action, sustainable action, flows not from fear or guilt or anger or even from a sense of duty, but from love. I have also learned that the capacity to feel and care is weakened when we try to care alone. Whatever you care about, the effect of toxic waste on the gene pool, forest practices, water quality, the goal of a viable economy and a healthy natural community, find someone who shares your interest and stand with that person and ask them to stand with you. In standing with other people, a strength and energy flow toward us that we never have when standing alone. A little story here. One of the things that I do is I serve on the Greenough Park Advisory Committee. One of the things we do is pull the Norway maples out of Greenough Park, hoping thus to make it possible for the original riparian forest along Rattlesnake Creek to survive. They don't stand a chance with the Norway maples. One morning I was working in the park with John Pierce, the chair of our committee, and after pulling about 700 maples, I started to whine and bitch and moan. And John heard me, and he said, "Gary, wait a minute, you have to remember there is a finite number of maples." Well, I don't happen to believe that there is a finite number of maples in Greenough Park. But the point is that John heard me, and he stood with me, and he recognized my own sense of hopelessness. So in standing with someone, we're better able to keep going. No amount of data or logic will move us if our capacity to care has been worn out. So one final way of being a steward of your own sensibility is to make sure that you care enough about yourself to maintain contact with the sources of wonder. At a planning meeting the other night, I wish that you could have heard Brian talk about a lunar rainbow at the base of Victoria Falls in her homeland of Zimbabwe. I wish that you could have heard Jim talk about the old-growth white pines around Mirror Lake in Michigan, whose arms seem to reach out and hold or embrace the lake, and as he felt his own life as well. And I wish you could have heard Tom talk about hoping to drive up to Glacier on a beautiful fall afternoon and instead deciding to go for a walk in what virtually amounts to his neighborhood and seeing deer and coyotes and hearing the geese overhead. The experience of wonder in relation to this creation that sustains us and countless others helps us retain an ability to care. Contact with the sources of wonder strengthens and steadies us when our own best efforts achieve no results or when we feel alone in our concern. A night under the stars, a walk along the river with friends, time in the garden, whatever it may be for you, help us see more deeply so that we do not miss the significance of such seemingly small things as one bird standing over another. I want to end my remarks by reading a poem by William Stafford. Stafford was a man who found a way to maintain his own sensibilities so that he could go on seeing. This is his poem, The Well Rising. The well rising without sound, the spring on a hillside, the plowshare brimming through deep ground everywhere in the field, the sharp swallows in their swerve, flaring and hesitating, hunting for the final curve, coming closer and closer. The swallow heart from wing beat to wing beat, counseling decision, decision. Thunderous examples. I place my feet with care in such a world.
I'm going to stand. It's easier for me to talk standing. I want to start with an image that probably is what inspires me to do the work that I do, and hopefully it will inspire you. Unfortunately, it's not a happy story like yours. But Lois Gibbs, the very famous woman from Love Canal, whose community was built on a toxic waste site, told me a story a year or so ago when she traveled to a community in Florida and visited this community because they were trying to be relocated by the Environmental Protection Agency because, again, there were so many hazardous compounds in their community that there were people dying of cancer in every single household. And she told the story of a little 3-year-old girl who was sent home from daycare because they couldn't handle her. She had body odor of an adult, along with a number of other problems. And what they discovered with this little girl is that her hormonal system was so advanced that she had the hormonal system of a teenager, and she started to develop breasts not long after that. And they predicted that she would probably start her menstruating when she was about 6 or 7 years old, and that she would go into menopause at the age of 19. And what they found in her body was levels of dioxin and other contaminants that were so high that they had completely altered her hormonal system. And there are wildlife species all over this planet whose habitat is intact, but who are no longer able to reproduce or are dying because of these hormonal changes in their bodies from so-called industrial hormones. So I and my organization have chosen to focus on these particular toxins. And what we're trying to do, though, instead of being like normal environmental organizations or the regular environmental organizations having a sort of very much in-your-face advocacy, we are trying to build coalitions with groups around the country, and unusual coalitions. So I'm really delighted to be invited to this conference because I very much would like to work more with churches. We try to reach out to organized labor. John mentioned, the whole jobs versus the environment issue. And we've been trying to work with unions and workers to say we essentially want the same thing. We all want good paying jobs and a healthy economy, but at the same time we all want clean air and clean water. And how do we find these solutions? So I want to talk to you about a very unusual form of activity that most people can become active in. And that is how you can use your investments to make a difference. Pat, a lady in the audience last night, talked about, well, what do we do when we have corporations who don't have the same sense of responsibility that we have out there, multinational corporations all over, plundering the globe all over the place. How do we get them to make a difference? Well, we can. And churches have really taken the lead role in doing this. We have been working with the United Methodist Church at the national level. The church has in its pension fund huge stock in Stone Container. Well, we've been working with Stone Container trying to get them to stop their use of chlorine, because chlorine in the paper making process produces dioxin, not only that goes into the Clark Fork River, but huge amounts of it that go right into the air that we breathe every day. So what we approached the church, and we did this through a group called the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. We were looking for someone who had shares in Stone Container. And we were delighted to find that the church not only had shares in Stone Container, but also already had a resolution on dioxin, saying that they wanted to see industries phase out the use of toxic chemicals like chlorine that produce dioxin. So we approached the church with our concerns in the paper industry, and they agreed to introduce a shareholders resolution. And I won't go into all the details of that shareholder resolution, but essentially it asked Stone Container to phase out the use of chlorine in all of its facilities, not only in our backyard, but all over the United States by the year 2000. I also want to give some examples of other shareholder resolutions that have been very successful. Kimberly-Clark, which is a company that presents itself as a health company, it makes paper products that are supplied to hospitals like Kleenex and plenty of others. Also have a tobacco division. They make the papers for the majority of cigarette manufacturers, as well as the filter material. And they have a patent on the tobacco reconstitution process, which is the nicotine process. And shareholders asked the company to divest of that division, but hadn't had much luck. Until one day, Father Michael Crosby of the Monastic Order of the Midwest presented when he'd gone to the shareholders meeting to present the resolution, and there really wasn't much response to it. But what was interesting, it was the day after the Oklahoma bombing, and the CEO of the company asked the shareholders and everybody at the meeting to please have a moment of silence to remember the people that had died in the bombing. Well, right after that, Father Crosby stood up and asked for a moment of silence for the 1,000 people who died that day from tobacco-related illnesses and the things that that company did, and the 1,000 people that would die the next day and the day after. Less than 3 weeks later, the company divested. DuPont, this is another current resolution that's going on right now. DuPont wants to strip mine along the eastern border of the famous Okefenokee Swamp. And what they want to do is strip mine for titanium oxide, which is a whitener that's used in toothpastes, for a covering on paper, paper coating, and often used in paint. Well, this I can't say it this morning, Okefenokee Swamp is a very, very unusual, it's a 700 square mile wetland. And it's called the Trembling Earth by the native people because it's actually floating islands. It's an incredibly unique ecosystem. And DuPont wants to wet dredge that takes a swath of a mile wide and dredges up this earth and then spits it out into a horrible mess behind. And they claim that this is not going to have any impact on the hydrology of the area. And when shareholders asked them to not do this, they said, well, you know, if you stop us or the government stops us, this will be a $500 million takings. Well, the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia, Dominican sisters, and Franklin Research and Development introduced a shareholders resolution asking the company not to mine this unique ecosystem, and not only to do that, but to retire the mining rights, which would make sure that nobody would ever mine it, but also that there would be no competition for DuPont. And as they pointed out to DuPont, this particular compound is very abundant all over the place, and there would be plenty of other places that they could go for it and get it. So now currently what's happening is that they're considering creating a world-class educational center there or doing a land swap. And actually it's interesting because Montana is one of the first places that shareholders resolutions were successful. Churches in this state worked with the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility in 1973 on coal strip and persuaded the tribes to withdraw many of the mineral rights. There's also a shareholders resolution going on with the Southwest Organizing Project with Intel. Local groups wanted the company to share what their plans were for the area and what was happening to their environment. The company refused to speak with what they called vocal minorities. Well, a foundation called the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation, who invests in socially responsible nonprofit organizations, supports them, introduced a share. They had investments in Intel, and they introduced a shareholders resolution and forced the company into dialogue with the company Intel into dialogue with the local communities. The churches have used their ability to move people in many different ways. The United Church of Christ in the Southeast when it was discovered, and John also mentioned this earlier, that people of color and low-income folks are most often impacted by hazardous waste sites. They are usually located in their communities because they have no political power to object to these kinds of developments. So the United Church of Christ did a study called Toxic Waste and Race, a national report on the racial and socioeconomic characteristics of communities with hazardous waste sites. And that report has had a profound impact on the kind where sites are being located. So just quickly want to wrap up by giving you some ideas about things that you can do either if you have your own shares, if you have your own pension fund, or if you are on a church board and can get your church to become involved. The first thing that you have to decide is, what your financial goals are, what your long-term goals are, and your short-term goals are. And then decide what your social reform goals are. Your investing goals can either be affirmative, you can support certain kinds of businesses, like businesses that are doing research on alternative energy, or you can do avoidance investing, where you can avoid certain types of industry, avoid, say, for instance, nuclear weapons industries, defense industries, or industries that use child labor or sweatshops overseas, or produce dioxin. The other thing you can do is vote your shares. Many people are not aware of the fact that when you own shares in a corporation, you are entitled to vote at the shareholders' meeting. So even if you didn't introduce a resolution, other people may have, and it's important for you to get involved and vote. Many people leave that voting up to their brokers or invest their money in mutual funds, and they no longer have a say in what they can do. So if that happens, roll over your investments, put them into places where you can have an impact and you can vote. Vote on the board of directors. Many churches in this country are pushing corporations to move away from all white male boards and pushing them to have great diversity on the boards, including women and people of color, because they believe a more diverse board will better represent the shareholders in the community. And you also need to check and see whether frequent times, if you look at corporations and the board of directors, you need to look at the types of people who are serving on the board. Sometimes you have people who sit on 15 or 20 boards, and they really can't have an impact on that particular corporation. The other thing is, a lot of times these board members are not active in the corporation. They come to a meeting and just go, yes, 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 yes. So look at who's on these board of directors, and you as a shareholder can vote them on or vote them off. And again, churches have been very active in that arena. And as a shareholder, you should voice your opinion to your company. Write letters to the company and tell them what you like and don't like about their business practices. I also want to encourage churches to get involved, because I really believe that communities of faith can have a profound impact on the environmental movement for a number of reasons. Because the number of people in this country that belong to a faith group or a church are huge. It's one of the biggest groups of people in this country. And they're also seen as mainstream, as opposed to environmentalists like me who are seen out as being out on the edge. So you can have a profound impact. But we can do some very basic things in our own life too. Be active, make sure you vote. For instance, in this election, we have an initiative on the ballot to ban cyanide heap leach mining. Unfortunately, corporations are going to be weighing in very heavily in this last week, now that the I-125 initiative was brought down. But be active, make sure you vote. Finally, I just want to end by saying that I think, for me, one of the biggest things that we need to do is look at how corporations function in our community. 100 years ago, corporations did not have the kind of power and structure that they have today. They had finite charters, and they had a responsibility to their communities and to the state. And if corporations misbehaved either with their labor practices or polluted the environment, states had the ability to not renew their charters. That was changed. I think at the beginning of the century, that was changed. And I really believe that that is something that we have to do, to turn around and say, corporations are not individuals under the Bill of Rights. And until we do that, I believe we'll be putting up brush fires. But I think there are lots of things that you can do. I also made a handout, well, one of my volunteers made a handout of 100 simple things that you can do at home to improve the environment. So I'll pass these out.
Do you have a short list?
Well, good morning. My name is Jim Birchfield, and I thought that being third on the panel would be kind of nice to sum things up, but I'm just overwhelmed by the presentations before me, and Gary so eloquently said just about everything that I wanted to say, that I think I'm just going to tell a couple of stories that might be helpful. The first story I want to tell is about an experience I had in Libby, Montana, and I'm not from Montana. As was mentioned, I'm actually from Michigan. I've lived here for a couple of years and feel very blessed to have the opportunity to live in such a wonderful community with people who not only care for creation, but they care about themselves, they care about their children. I guess it's all creation. So it's some place where you can just sense, being here in Missoula, that there's a solidarity here towards one another, and I'm grateful to be here. But I'm learning about Montana and what it means, and about the transitions that are going on here, and the difficulty that people face in trying to understand what is it that's appropriate for me to do as I try these approaches to stewardship. What can an individual do? There's 100 things that were just passed out. But what is it that we can do not only as individuals, but as a community? What can we do as groups of people? And people in Libby, Montana have faced a lot of changes recently. The mines have closed down. The major mill shut down in 1991 and is only a shadow of its former self. Here's a town that really defined itself through harvesting forests, through turning trees into boards. It has a fabulous cultural history that's being defined through photographs by school children that show the old logging camps, that show the downtown made out of wood, that show the logger days when people proudly displayed the tools of their trade and the skills that they had in the woods. And now, just because of international transitions in wood markets that were described by John, because of changes in policies on public lands that are fairly widespread and nationally recognized, that we sense that our public lands are for more than wood production we have in the past. Places like Libby are suddenly recognizing that they have to be able to somehow respond to these changes. And their initial responses were very angry and very confrontational. There was blaming the environmentalists for shutting down the woods. There was blaming the grizzly bears for shutting down the woods. There was all kinds of finger pointing that the people who were doing logging were really evil people who were destroying the forest and really didn't care about the land. And lo and behold, people thought that perhaps this wasn't really a reasonable response. Perhaps by fighting with one another, they really weren't serving the needs of their community. So they came together and formed this group called the Kootenai Forest Congress. And on one hand, you have Rick Bass, the wonderful environmental writer, who I'm sure many of us are familiar with, and whose books are out there on the table, who has this profound sense of the value of wildness and what it means to the human spirit. And on the other hand, you have Bruce Vincent, who's the leader of Communities for a Great Northwest, who comes from a logging family, who wants to advocate for working people. Remember, Libby used to be a labor town. Libby was kind of the classic Democratic bastion of the same ilk from where I came from the auto plants in Michigan. And because of this tearing asunder, suddenly people who had been in kind of a union solidarity with one another were finding themselves pitted against each other and blaming one another for their problems. And Bruce Vincent is attempting to try to draw together those working people to see, is there a future for timber harvesting in the forest? And at this table were Rick Bass and Bruce Vincent talking about what their community meant, not what their jobs meant, not how much money they would bring to them, but what it meant to be part of this place that Libby defined. And I thought to myself, this is perhaps the most advanced discussion I've ever heard about the environment. Because it's not about specific kinds of biological outcomes or ecological processes. It's about how people inhabit the forest. And they continue to struggle because of a lot of different institutions institutional effects and a lot of different administrative kinds of problems that have come up. But they continue to meet, and I feel flattered that they've invited me sometimes to participate in their group, to be able to wind their way through and find some projects and make plans and actually go out and evaluate what happens on the forest so that they can understand as a group what it means to inhabit the forest. Because they recognize some of the pathologies that are occurring there. Now, Bruce Vincent told me this story that really rang home. We've heard a lot about grizzly bears. He mentioned that his neighbor used to really enjoy sighting the bears, and they would come over for dinner on every Friday night. And it used to be when he saw the bears, he would say, "Oh, I saw this bear in the woods, and it was this color, and it was a sow, and it had 2 cubs." And the kids would be interested in where it was, and how big it was, and if it was eating anything, or what else was going on. And as time has progressed over the last 6 or 7 years, those same families still come together to have dinner. But now when one of them, who was still working in the woods, spots a bear, he says, "I saw one of those damn bears." So in other words, the institutional effects that were very well-meaning by national interest to protect grizzly bear habitat have had the unfortunate consequence of turning the people who live there against the very animals that define their coexistence. And so something really has to be done in terms of people being able to learn about not only what the bear's habitat needs are, but about what their own needs are related to the forest. And I see that Kootenai Forest Congress and other volunteer groups throughout Montana actually taking that on independently. And so that's what I want to advocate for, is what Gary has just described, is this caring alone just isn't enough. Somehow sharing your interest with someone else. And the most difficult thing of all is sharing your interest with someone who thinks very differently from you. In other words, trying and making a conscious attempt to cross those value boundaries. The biggest mistake I think my generation made during the period of the Vietnam conflict was to somehow demonize rednecks as people who were not really Americans. Because of this kind of class division that was occurring during that period of time, there was this finger pointing that one side loved America and love it or leave it, and the other side hated America because they protested what the country was doing in Vietnam. But what happened is that we separated ourselves both culturally and spiritually from one another. We were really all working people who didn't really approve of war, but certainly did not disapprove of hard work, of families, of communities, and trying to sort through problems. But by some twist of our own ideologies, we separated each other and became enemies. And I think that echo of that discord still resonates with us today. That people in Libby still view environmentalists as somehow leftist, untrustworthy non-Americans. And those who are there working, even though people with environmental inclinations have deep feelings and caring about the environment and about working people, haven't been able to communicate those on terms that working people really understand. But I see at this community level people attempting to cross those bridges, recognizing that that's a false division, that we indeed are one people residing on this planet. And I'm encouraged by that. And I'm also encouraged by our recognition of how different cultures have been able to respond to the environment. And there are many different forms in which we can organize our communities. And we're learning about those. And I'll close with a story that just happened to me this week about a graduate student presentation on a community in Nicaragua in which a group of Mayagnan Indians has resisted market forces consciously over the past 1,000 years. And I say market forces in that they resisted the Aztecs from Mexico. They resisted the early British incursions in eastern Nicaragua. And then they have resisted the Sandinistas and the Spanish coming from the south and western part of Nicaragua who wanted to draw them into a larger economy. They define themselves not as individuals, but as a community. They define their well-being not as the well-being of an individual, but as how the community would prosper. And when John was talking about that hierarchy of God, community, and the individual, we here in our culture have somehow lost the thread of our community, what it is that allows us to interact as a whole. And here in this description of these Mayaguan Indians in Nicaragua, I came to the understanding that we don't have to hold the individual in the highest status for all of our actions. We can hold our communities in a situation where we sacrifice for the good of the whole. It can be successful. It means sacrifice. It means the kind of thing that Gary was talking about and Brianna was talking about in participating in your future. And that's perhaps some of the hardest thing to do. To be able to recognize that it's in our ultimate self-interest to give up perhaps those individual pleasures for a little while and work in a volunteer organization and figure out how you can communicate with someone very different than you are. I suggest that those rewards are truly profound. And I've been very, very honored to be able to live in a city like Missoula where that seems to be common behavior. And we should celebrate that. And I'm glad we can celebrate that on a day like today.
I didn't have much thunder to begin with, but I have none now. I guess my role, I noticed when Brian was talking about corporations and that historically they didn't have the privileges they have today. She said it was, she thought the law changed sometime around the turn of the century, and I noticed she turned to this end of the table. And I'm not sure what that meant, Jim, whether she assumes we go back that far or not. All of us, all four of us panelists have talked over the weeks about what we would do in our discussions today, and I find myself as the last one suddenly changing what I was going to say, but I hope this is useful. The two sort of points I want to make. One is each of the preceding panelists in his or her own way has said something about the church and the institutional importance of the church, and I want to tie my remarks to that. I also want to attempt at some level to perhaps personalize some of what's been said a little bit more directly, because it seems to me that it might be very easy, particularly on a lovely day like today, to leave feeling pretty glowing and then getting home and thinking, well, the words were great, but I got my list of 100 things to do, but I'm still kind of lost. And let me try and share what I'm talking about by just saying where I am with respect to this notion of, on the one hand, caring and being responsible, and then weighing that against the sort of social realities we live with. My wife and I used to own a piece of property up off Rock Creek on a place called Stony Creek, and we bought it with some other folks. It was one of these that we bought it early on when we moved to Montana to have our piece of Montana. A bad mistake financially, but an entertaining idea. We had no money left to do anything on the property, so we used to drive up and camp or walk and hike around. And when we first purchased the property, there was a Forest Service road that ran right through the middle of the property, and there was a creek, Stony Creek, that just paralleled the road. I mean, just dead even, straight shot. Very nice little creek, year-round stream. Well, over the years, some beaver moved in. And the beaver started building dams, and the creek it became less straight, let's put it that way. And at some point, my wife and I realized our two boys were nearing college age, and we needed some money. And we decided we're going to have to sell Stony Creek. And so I would drive up, one time I was driving up with my oldest son, or our oldest son, Graham, kind of looking around thinking, okay, we're going to sell this, kind of one last look at the property, and also trying to think how might we appropriately sell this. And I remarked to Graham that, gee whiz, the property might even be less valuable today than it was when we bought it, and that we'd sort of gotten skunked on this deal. And he sort of said, why? And I said, well, look, we now have a 3 or 4 acre, real shallow, sort of boggy pond that's been created by these beaver, which was true. And in a sense, our land has been depreciated. And we're driving home, and I'm, moaning about this loss. And, how am I going to explain this to Sue, my wife, that, by God, we may not even get our money back because of these damn beaver and so forth. And my son, who was about 10 or 12 years old, turned over and looked dead center in the eye. And he said, well, we never owned the land to begin with. And I thought, I mean, driving along, and I thought, well, come by with that, come at me with that again. And he said, we never owned the land to begin with. This is the Beavers' land. And I thought, yes, absolutely right. Now, I mention that story because I can get very wound up in listening to someone like John Hart and Gary and reading some of the literature that's out on that table by people like Rick Bass, extraordinarily eloquent. And I want to live my life as if all creatures were equal, as if indeed I value creation. And yet I have a hard time doing that, to be honest, day to day. And I think one of the few times I've ever really seen or felt, I think intellectually I've understood it, but one of the few times I've ever really felt or understood it was that chance comment my son made about this piece of land that I had thought for 15 years belonged to us, but in fact had all along belonged to the Beavers. Thursday, my wife and I went up to Glacier Park to do something, and it was a beautiful day. Came back later in the evening, turned on television. I'm almost embarrassed to tell Brian why. Kind of to see how the stock market was doing. We have another piece of property in mind, and you see, and there's the dilemma I think that all of us face. And what I got instead was a Dusty Dayshaw ad, and it's some woman who lives out here in Bonner or something, and she works 2 jobs, and she lives in a trailer, and she doesn't have adequate daycare, and she's still, poverty level or below. Bam! Boy, did the reality hit me. We'd had this incredible day at Glacier Park. We intended to hike. It was foggy. Instead, we were able to drive up to the loop on going to the Sunday, close the road down, and we hiked up the road. It sounds like, how could that be a bit fun? It was great. No cars, absolutely beautiful, so forth. And then come home, bingo, here's Dusty Dayshaw, sort of reminding me that this is nice for you and your wife, but there are many, many Montanans who are out there busting their hump, barely surviving. Ergo, this lady. And I want to just say a bit more about that social reality. I think some of you know this, but I think it bears emphasizing as we move through the day. Montana has the fastest growing poverty rate in the United States. Got great scenery, but we got a lot of poor people, and we're getting more of them. We've had a lot of new job growth, but all of that job growth has been in the secondary labor market. The secondary labor market is characterized by jobs that are temporary, pay no benefits, and workers have no protection. What's the chief source of such jobs today? Tourism. John mentioned tourism this morning. Yeah, tourism's among the 4th biggest industry in Montana today. And we tout it as the alternative to the kind of industrial blight that might otherwise befall us. But we need to understand that others pay a price for that tourism. We may be fortunate, we may not have to pay a price for it, but others do. And what's the price? Well, the price is having to work 2 jobs, as this woman in Bonner is, or to put it in a little more statistical terms. In 1950, if you worked full-time, let me phrase this again. A 2-parent family with 2 kids, if both parents worked full-time at the minimum wage in 1950, you would have earned 110% of what were identified as the basic necessities of life. But in 1997, those same 2 parents working at the minimum wage would make only enough to cover 70% of the basic necessities. Between 1949 and 1976, the average worker's wage doubled. Between 1976 and 1996, the average worker's wage increased only 22%. To say this a little differently, a 30-year-old male, well, hell, I just gave you those numbers. Sorry. We have an unemployment rate that today is among the lowest in the nation's history, 7 million unemployed nationwide. Montana has a low unemployment rate. But we have 4 million people who were working part-time, who want to work full-time, but they can't find full-time jobs. Why? Because the job growth has been in the secondary labor market. Secondary labor jobs, like those in the tourism industry, are almost always part-time jobs. Why? Because the firms can avoid paying benefits and being subject to federal laws that protect workers. We have 7 million people who work full-time in this nation who make less than $7 an hour. They are the so-called working poor. They don't make enough to provide for the basic necessities of life. Ironically, while this is going on, that is, while real wages for American workers are declining, and while the unemployment rate, as it's defined formally, has gone down, the fact is that employment for many American workers is less advantageous today than it once was. While that's going on, we have a whole new class of Americans who are emerging, the so-called, and I'll pass this little article out, the so-called new comfortable class. These are folks, families, whose income was over $100,000 a year. In 1967, 3.2% of American families had incomes of over $100,000. In 1997, 11.8% of American families had incomes of over $100,000 a year. Remember, we said that the average wage earner's wage increased 22% during this time period. But we have a practically 400% increase in the number of American families whose income is over $100,000 a year during that same time period. Indeed, between 1994 and 1996, the number of families in the United States whose incomes were over $1 million a year doubled. What do we do with all this? This is the dilemma I personally find myself in. I love Stony Creek. I love Glacier Park. I think we need to have those kinds of experiences that Gary so eloquently spoke about, that put us in touch with the larger reality, with this creation that we have. And yet at the same time, within this creation, we have these hard realities. We have increasing numbers of Americans who are not making it. Brian, he talks about the dioxin. It's awful. Stone Container last night or 2 nights ago announced it was shutting down for a month. 500 Missoulians without jobs for at least 1 month. I don't like dioxin, but what do we do for the folks at Stone? What do we do about the poor lady in Bonner who's working her fanny off, supporting 2 kids, working 2 jobs and not making it? What do we do about the fact that increasingly we're a society where there's less middle class, and remember, progressive movements, be they social movements, be they anti-war movements, be they environmental movements, have by and large fed off the middle class. We have a shrinking middle class, we have a growing working poor class, and we have this so-called new comfortable class. How does this relate to the churches? I think this relates to the churches in a very profound way. Jim has eloquently described what can happen in a community that's in crisis. The community comes together and identifies the common ground. The problem with what I'm talking about is that the crisis is still at sort of an intellectual level. I mean, the numbers are there, but hey, we live in neighborhoods where most of us are working, or we live in neighborhoods where most of us aren't, and we don't get together. We don't have the kinds of institutional vehicles available in many communities to sort of address the environmental concerns and these social realities. And yet, the environmental movement cannot succeed at its agenda unless it takes seriously the reality that many working Americans face. The one institution that every community has is the church. It's the one institution that historically embodies, as John has so eloquently said, a vision, a sense of what this creation is about what our purpose in life is about. So it's the one institution that can point us forward. At the same time, it's the one institution that at its very best draws us all in, regardless of our class, and thus can create the context wherein we can have the kinds of dialogues that Jim described in Libby, in every community across Montana. If environmentalists are to succeed with their agenda, that's the kind of dialogue that we need to have. I think we're done. Bob?
I have a question of Dr. Hart and Jim. I'm really profited by your illustrations, but do we have a thing about bears? All the examples of bears just kind of struck me as being interesting and somewhat humorous. No, I don't have a real
Well, no, let
question.
me-
I'm just making a silly
No,
comment.
let me respond to that question, because the bear has in many respects become the symbol of the wild, at least for here in Montana. Not only is it the state symbol, but it's a symbol of something that's not controllable by humans. And in that respect, it's very powerful, it's very evocative. And I think all of us who have hiked in bear country, there's always in the back of your mind this recognition that you're really a piece of meat. And there's something very connecting to nature about that. We talk about the area of nature. We really realize, because of bears, I think, that we are part of the world, and that there is some relationship there.
Right.
Now, there's been tremendous effort because bears have lost their old range dramatically, have been extricated from many of their old habitats. And there is a profound sense that we want to be able to allow bears to flourish as part of these ecosystems. There's been heroic efforts to try to reintroduce them, like in the Selway Bitterroot, or to manage the existing populations so they don't decline. And there's a lot of conflicting research that goes on. One of the biggest causes of mortality of bears, for example, is management movement. You try to take what's a problem bear that's getting into somebody's cabin somewhere and move them someplace else, that frequently kills the bear. There are problems in terms of fertility and reproduction of the bears because of lower populations. So dealing with bears is a very complicated, both ecological and scientific issue, as well as a social issue, because the interaction between humans and bears usually means the bear loses. Even though we're afraid of bears, we have all climbing the trees and we're going to get killed by the bear, the bottom line is that when humans interact with bears, bears die. And so the strategy of management agencies has been to reduce human access to bear habitat, basically closing roads, which really upsets people. It upsets people deeply because that's their contact with nature that Gary describes. We care about creation, we want to experience it. And yet here's this contradiction that by being part of nature, we're actually hurting nature. And so it's one of the most difficult environmental problems that I've ever encountered. And the fact that there are groups like Common Ground up in Flathead and the group down in the Bitterroot attempting to deal with it, I think is tremendous. The results are clearly unknown, but at least there's this consciousness of us wanting to live with this wild creature.
Thank you.
I just want to add a comment to that. Hank Fisher from the Defenders of Wildlife the other night made a wonderful comment about bears. He said, which relates to what you were saying in our relationship to bears, and how we're always very nervous when we get between a female bear and her cubs. And we said, what Hank said is, we have to imagine what the bear feels when it gets between a Homo sapien and a dollar bill.
I have a question for Dr. Hart on the subject of sustainable agriculture and non-chemical agriculture. Have you come across any research that indicates that we've taken any lessons from people like the Amish, or, you know, the folks that have been doing that since the beginning in this country? Have they taught us anything about the advantages of that way of life?
I'm not sure how much you've heard about. I know one time when I lived in Amish colony, this is on the East Coast, they did use chemicals, which surprised me. I thought it was an ideal kind of type of community, because they had, of course, rejected a lot of other aspects of technological advances and so forth. The people that I have worked with, I think, communicate with each other. There's a number of organizations in Montana that work on organic agriculture issues, like Arrow, for example,
Yeah.
like, sustainable agriculture. It's like the logging issue, I think, where people feel threatened that they're going to lose their livelihood, and it takes someone who's already done it, maybe because they've read the research, but they've found out that they can not only survive but do well in organic agriculture, to tell a fellow farmer, you can actually do better by doing this, and it's healthy for you, it's healthy for the people who consume what you produce, and it's healthy generally for the environment in which you're located and so forth. And I think that has a greater impact. Sometimes there's antagonism to groups like the Equator Rights and the Amish, because they see it's buying a whole lot of land and so forth, which of course they're able to do because of a simple lifestyle and a concern for community, a very community-oriented groups. But I think it makes most impact when someone has tried it out and found out you can make a living as a farmer. In fact, you have a better chance of doing it as the economy changes than by depending on petroleum-based kinds of inputs and getting heavier equipment and all the other kinds of things that I mentioned. I think the Equator Rights, the Amish give us examples of a simpler kind of living and community-oriented kind of living, which they can have, of course, good economic benefits to them and other people. Maybe, for example, farmers buying things together cooperatively or even forming cooperatives. I would see that as a potentially a very beneficial form of economic structure for agriculture, and also for industry, for formation of cooperatives. It can help survival and also help people prosper. I remember the mention was made in Nicaragua. One of the first programs they did in Nicaragua in 1979 was with some aid from some consultants from the United States to put in a program called Tear Down the Fences. And they want to promote better, smaller scale agriculture, family farm kind of agriculture. But they were familiar with the process in Mexico whereby it's roughly about 30 years ago where an outgoing president redistributed land to 20,000 peasants. And it sounded good, 20,000 people get land, but the amount of acreage was so small that after a time the people couldn't survive on it, so they wound up selling the land back to the original landowner, large-scale landowner, and they were back where they were before. So redistribution is a necessity in Latin America, but the size of the farm has to be large enough for a family to survive, or to work cooperatively. So the Tear Down the Fences program in Nicaragua decided that instead of, they had some redistribution, but also that they would try to get neighboring farmers to literally, if there were fences, to tear down the fences. And then let's say somebody had 10 acres, some had 5 acres, some had 50 acres, and so forth, but they would work the whole collection of farms as one farm, and they would work it together, and when the government gave them no interest loans, and they could buy maybe a tractor and maybe a truck and take their produce to the market and so forth. And when that happened at the end of the year, when they all worked together as one large farm, at the end of the year they divide their profits up. So let's say there were 100 acres, if I had 5, I get 5%, someone had 50 acres, got 50%, and so forth. So you still retain ownership, you still own your particular piece of land, but you worked it as a cooperative. And I think if farmers would explore that, which is one thing I see coming out of looking at the Amish and Equator Rights, it's more economically viable. People talk about being independent, self-sufficient, and so forth, but when they step back otherwise over the coffee, they're talking about the weather, they're talking about the global markets, and so forth. So they're not really independent, even though there's this kind of mythos of the farmer as being an independent person. So I think looking at cooperatives, cooperative buying of seed, for example, cooperative sharing of machinery, even maybe something like continuous farms working together, and then dividing the profits up according to the percentage of acreage. Those are the things that we learned in those kinds of communities.
I would like to add a little bit more to that from the consumer aspect. I've been a member of a CSA for a few years. It's kind of taking a sabbatical right now, but what I found that was really interesting was, it's wonderful to get the producers and the farmers to change what they do, but it's almost more difficult, in my experience, to get the consumers or the eaters to change what we do, because we had a terrible time trying to get membership for the CSA. It was just incredible. People would say, "Oh, I don't have the money right now. Can't do it this year. Maybe next year. We don't have the time." But it's basically defunct right now because people are not real interested in changing their buying habits. So that's kind of the other part of that. I mean, as participants, we can do a lot there. There are people out there, there are farmers who are willing to do this kind of thing, but we have to support them. We have to be interested. We have to change the way we shop. We have to change the way we consume and buy our food. So that's the other part of that. They need our support. There are people out there.
Maybe a corollary to that also is to get food chains to buy locally instead of having the kinds of products shipped from other parts of the country. Also universities and colleges to try to support local agriculture by buying locally. Often if you have a national chain like the Marriott or whatever food service you might have here, they bring things from all over and therefore you don't have support for local agriculture.
And I think as consumers, we have to make those decisions every single day with everything that we buy.
It's very hard
And it is very hard.
to change.
My housemate said to me the other day, she said, I had gotten a Patagonia catalog, and I try to stay off all bulk mail things, but I do enjoy the Patagonia catalog. And it came in the mail, and she said, well, I would never buy anything from Patagonia. For those of you who don't know, Patagonia is an outdoor clothing company. Probably most people in this room do know. And she said, because they're far too expensive. And I said to her, well, I would prefer to choose Patagonia over a cheaper brand for a good reason. And there's a good reason why Patagonia's clothing is more expensive, because they make a product to last for a lifetime, so that you only ever have to buy one of it rather than having to replace it every few years. They do an environmental impact analysis on every single product they make. They've looked into whether it's more damaging to the environment to buy cotton that's processed with, pesticides. Cotton uses more pesticides than any other crop, or whether it's better to use a petroleum-based product like some form of nylon. And the other thing that the company does is that they provide incredible working conditions for their workers, including childcare all the way up to teen children, making sure that their employees get time off every single day to exercise so that they stay healthy. Patagonia recently made a switch to using only organic cotton, which was a very difficult thing to do in this country, because not only did they have to find growers that would grow organic cotton, but they had to find a cotton gin, that would only process organic cotton so that it wouldn't be contaminated during the process. Well, that pushed their prices up significantly. But it goes back to what John Hart was saying about the hidden costs. So yes, your t-shirt may cost $3 or $4 more to buy an organic t-shirt, but you are saving so many more dollars somewhere else, in somebody else's health, in the workers in the field, and so on and so on and so on. So I think that we have to make those kind of considerations, and I think we have to look at, for instance, when we buy products, what kind of packaging does it come in? Does it come in glass that's non-toxic to the environment? I know it's difficult in Missoula to recycle it. It's an issue that we have to address. But we need to look at, the packaging that it comes in is what's it made of in the first place? What can we do with it afterwards? Could we buy the product in bulk and not use the packaging and take our jar back to the store and refill it? And I think that one of the most profound things that we have to do, and I really, it's as Tom says, it's always a challenge. But I think, I love beautiful things. And I don't go shopping very often, but once in a while, and I do, I say, oh, I'd love that vase, or I'd love that pillow, or whatever it is. And I have to say to myself, why am I choosing to buy this? Do I need this product? Or am I just buying it because I want it? And I'm not saying don't ever buy things because you don't want them, but it's always useful to take a moment and really consider why you're buying something, and by buying this product, what your impact is on the environment. Until you start to change the way you think about things and it becomes a normal part of your process every day.
Can you just speak? There's been a lot said in this panel discussion. It's really interesting to me. The reason why I came to the conference was to see what was up. The way it's, first let's go back to the cooperatives. In the United States, we've had everything from ranges to the 60s and 70s food cooperatives. And in the last few years, Co-op America has stated that organic foods and food products and jumped something like 300% in sales. And I thought, wow, this is really good, having known a number of sustainable agriculture farmers and community supported agriculture entities and so on. And then I thought, well, how many of these producers have been co-opted by larger organizations like General Foods, Celestial Seasonings, and that sort of thing? But it does have something to do with consumerism and lifestyle. And when we talk about making the switch and making the transition and having a lifestyle that all types of people can relate to in order to bring about a more healthy environment, and the possibility of the church being a leader in that transition, it sounds hopeful. I'm just wondering if on ecumenical levels there are discussions going on that foresee this vision. For example, if you have large, like in the Reagan administration, they wanted it to trickle down, they wanted to have private entities take over a lot of the grant giving and so on and so forth, and devolve government from its social and environmental responsibilities in that direction. And in the church, I assume, is the natural holding tank for people having to come in, this lower income standard has produced a lot more poor people in the country. The churches are taking up the slack, and the food banks are getting bigger, and that having a better economy. But it seems to me as though the switch or the transition has a lot to do with lifestyle. And then when you bring that to spirituality and reality and bringing together all the different groups, it lays an awfully big job on the table. Environmentalists, in my opinion, are generally led by maybe a subconscious, if not conscious, understanding that the life force is sacred, and that's why we go out there in all the various levels and slog to try to save the life force. It seems as though the churches would have been a natural ally in that respect. And that all people will be. And so, for me, it's really important to see if there's not going to be one simple answer, but to see if there is a large conscious movement in all the ecumenical circles to start looking at the transition not just for the social and moral values that need to be in place to get these greater numbers of people facilitated through this transition that we're going to go through with the environment, but a mindset and a change in the form of how churches go about doing it. I'm wondering if Dr. Hart is seeing his travels in the church.
A number of different churches, the World Council of Churches has had a focus on environment for a while. I mentioned last night, U.S. Catholic bishops set up an Office of Environmental Justice in Washington, D.C. A few years ago. And they're giving grants around the country. In Montana, locally, the Montana Association of Churches is working on a new statement, the revised statement that was one of the passed on environmental justice, which goes to the Assembly this coming, next Monday and Tuesday, I guess. And Betty Waddell has been working on that. So that's something locally in Montana when people are trying to integrate the churches in an ecumenical effort to promote care for the environment. From there, it's a matter of people. One sense, when you learn about a statement, they try to see how it can be put into effect in a particular congregation or parish. The other side of it is maybe ideally not to wait for church bodies officially to say something, or church leaders, that people begin to work together among themselves to find these things out. And sometimes they educate their pastors. And I think it's very hopeful that people can work together. And that's, of course, the primary purpose of this gathering, is to see where people from primarily environmental backgrounds, those from primarily faith backgrounds, learn how to work together with the different kinds of expertise and commitment they have, the potential for change, especially, I think, in a state the size of Montana in terms of population, where you can have a greater communication, people know each other more because it's not such a kind of mass centering of people. The potential for change, I think, is significant. The seed has been planted. The churches have begun to get involved in the issue. I think now it's a matter of members of the churches to keep that going, to find ways of, within the church itself or extending out to other groups, to find, again, common projects that folks can work on together. I think there'll be some kind of sign-up for people for, maybe for the MACAN group, Montana Association of Churches, Christian Advocates Network, where people can work together in groups, and but again, also with environmental groups. Last year I spoke with the Montana Wilderness Association, other folks did from faith backgrounds, and they're interested in having an ongoing dialogue to work together. A few years ago I spoke to NDIC's annual convention. There's an interest out there, and if people can kind of translate the interest, as pointed out by members of the panel as well, into concrete proposals. And again, I think it's looking at the long term. What's